Hello and welcome to Shropshire Museums Collections Centre. We're here in the biology store, which is home to over 80,000 specimens, which include birds, mammals, plants and shells, a whole range of different materials that have been collected over 170 years. These come from both Shropshire but also from further afield in the world. And we'll look at in this film with Nigel McDonald how these collections were amassed over that period and what they tell us about both the collectors and collecting. So in the Victorian period, there was this kind of fascination with the natural world and trying to understand it better. So people were starting to collect things to try and understand how the geology and the natural history of Shropshire and the world at large had developed. And you get these groups of kind of early antiquarians and historians coming together to share their collections and to try and understand the world better. There were a group here in Ludlow who met regularly, and they were contacted by other scientists from around the world, including Roderick Impey Murchison, who was one of the very founders of the science of geology. He came to know about this group in Ludlow and the fact that people like Dr. Lloyd in the town was out collecting fossils like this. And really pulling together collections that were starting to explain how each layer of rock had different fossils and different formations in it. Roderick Murchison wanted to really come to grips with the different layers, so was looking for collections like these to help him better understand the rocks. So he came and spent time with Dr. Lloyd and his contemporaries in the town, and eventually pulled together the first kind of big geological study, which is this amazing book called The Silurian Period that he published in the 1840s. And specimens from Ludlow like these appear in the book as he understands exactly how these rocks were formed and what they told us about the geological past.
Can I have a look at your fossil?
You can look at my fossil.
Thank you.
So this is a coral from Much Wenlock.
I was going to ask you, see, because, well, I know the Shropshire Hills quite well, so Much Wenlock.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I don't think I've ever seen anything like this sort of rolling around. Would you have had to dig it up?
Yeah, I mean, that one has kind of eroded out of the limestone. The actual coral itself is slightly harder than the surrounding limestone, so has kind of eroded out so you can see the shape of it. But that, along with different shells, are really kind of typical of different layers within the rock and allowed them to match them up across Shropshire and across Britain as a whole and understand how those layers relate right across Britain.
You see, now I'm holding this quite a heavy thing, and I'm thinking there's a young man at a rock face with his hammer, with his shirt sleeves rolled up, probably in the summer, and he's digging away excitedly. Probably, if there's people walking past, they say, "What's he doing?" And they found something. So just remind me, when did he dig this? When did he find this?
This dates from the 1830s, so he was collecting then, at a time when people still thought that shells and fossils that came out of the ground were signs of the Great Flood. So some people would have seen it as evidence that Noah had floated past, but he was part of a group of people who were thinking, actually, there's something more complicated going on here. Was trying to better understand the landscape around him.
That's fascinating. Well, I shall look out with a little bit more caution and a little bit more care next time I'm walking on the Wenlock Edge, because I'd like to find something like that. That's amazing.
But I mean, the book that Murchison produced is just beautiful. There are drawings of the landscape as well. So he's included beautiful plates, one here of Ludlow Castle. And then further on in, there are drawings of other fossils that he's looked at. So in this book, he carefully goes through each of the different layers, looking at different formations within the rock that are typical of that geological period, and fossils as well. And because the geology of Shropshire had such an impact on him that he named a lot of these different formations and layers after Shropshire places. So you have the Ludlow series, the Much Wenlock series, all relating back to his studies here.
And these are phrases that are used all over the world, aren't they?
They
People
are.
talk about the Ludlow series in South America.
Yes. I mean, that's what he was really getting to grips, was that the rocks of Shropshire weren't specific to Shropshire, that they joined up with rocks across Britain, Europe, the world at large, and that those names are used for the same layers right across the planet.
Fantastic. And if we can go back to this picture. So not only was he a geologist and somebody who's trying to make it, basically making it up as he went along, he was also a really fantastic artist.
Well, these plates were prepared for him, so
he
would have got an artist to come in and do those for him.
This man is multi-talented.
But he was certainly interested not only in the rocks, but the landscape that they formed, the buildings that were created from that geology. So,
so
in a very modern way, he was looking at geology as a whole and how it shapes the world around us. Mm. So the enthusiasm that Murchison had for the research on the geology of Shropshire and from looking at the rocks that had been collected here, that really acted as a catalyst for the local naturalists to come together and decide to form a society. So they formed the Ludlow Natural History Society in 1833. And then they decide that they really need a museum as well, so that those collections can be made available to other researchers and also for people locally to come and see what was happening in science really at that time. So we've got books like our accession registers that show the types of things that were being given, both here in Ludlow, but also at museums that were being formed in Shrewsbury. The Shropshire and North Wales Archaeological and Historical Society was formed in 1835, so they weren't going to be left behind. And they start forming collections as well. So I'll get you an accession register to look at.
Excellent. Another heavy tome.
Another big
Smaller
book.
Though, yeah. Oh, handwritten. Gosh, they had beautiful writing back then, didn't they?
Yes.
Was this person employed for their writing?
Well, I think everyone had beautiful writing then. It just makes you ashamed these days when you fill in modern museum records that how poor it looks in comparison. So this is the very first accession register for Shrewsbury Museum and Art Gallery when it opened in 1835.
So just bring me up to speed. An accession register, what are we talking about?
So this is the book that they write down the details of everything that's given to the museum. So the idea is that this is the first record of everything that comes into the museum and all the information that's given to the museum about those objects as they come in. Okay. So here we've got things that came in on the 28th of August and it lists them down here.
What's the year?
The year is 1835, so the museum is still very shiny and new. And we have here a Mr. Leighton of Shrewsbury, and that is a chap who was particularly interested in plants. And we have one of the specimens that he gave to the museum then here. So it's still in the museum today. And then next to it is one from a Thomas Campbell Iton, and that's the other specimen on this sheet here, who also gave a number of botanical specimens, but his particular interest was in birds. So he gave a number of taxidermy specimens of birds and prepared birds' eggs as well.
Gosh.
Now, these two young men who were real founders of the museum, they were involved in actually coming up with the idea of creating a museum. They both were friends and colleagues of Darwin. So they all went to Cambridge University together. They all studied under the same Professor Henslow, who was particularly interested in botany and geology. And he really encouraged the boys, their interest in these subjects. So when they left university, Darwin sets off on the Beagle to go and explore the world. And his friends that are left behind decide, right, well, we're going to found a museum in the town and we're going to start doing our own research about the local area and find out what we can.
Incredible. I was going to the way these are laid out is clearly very professional. These guys aren't amateurs, really, are they? They're highly skilled.
No, they see themselves as scientists at the cutting edge of science. Yes. And in fact, Leighton goes on to use all these specimens he's collected to write the first Flora of Shropshire. So this is the first academic book that looks at what plant species are found in Shropshire and how they're distributed around the county. So they're really at the cutting edge.
This is a competition, isn't it? There's got to be some ego. So Darwin's off on the Beagle. What can we do?
Very much. And they write to Darwin as well and tell him what they're doing. And Darwin sends back his subs to join the museum and then is later made an honorary member. And of course, the early museum was at the building where Shrewsbury Library is now. So eventually Darwin's statue is actually put up outside the museum.
And this is the thing, Darwin didn't know he was Darwin then, did he?
No.
Well, we know Darwin and we go, whoa, Darwin, origin of the species. But at that time, he was just another young scientist just following his passion.
Yes, yeah, and surrounded by others that encouraged it. And I think that's what was special about Shrewsbury in this period, is there were a lot of people who really were taking on this new idea of studying the world and understanding it seriously, and were going out there and collecting the data and putting it together to come up with theories. And it's that atmosphere that created the Darwin that we all know today.
And these weren't popular ideas either, were they? These were ideas that were challenging people's faith.
Yes, and there are fallings out. In fact, Eiton, he didn't like Darwin's idea of evolution, and they did sort of scrape up against each other over some of their theories. So they were men who were challenging each other and really asking quite kind of profound questions that affected their faith and their relationships with other people.
I can't imagine that any of these men were the kind of people who would take anything on face value. They're going to look at it from all angles, aren't they? So Darwin comes up with an idea, and I can imagine the banter between him and his contemporaries about, could this possibly be the way that how the world was created? It's 200 years since these ideas were bubbling up, and they were a completely new way of looking at the world.
Yes, and we think of kind of museums in the Victorian period being a kind of a fusty place.
Yeah.
But no, these were men in their 20s and 30s who wanted to be at the cutting edge of things, and they set up a reading room in the museum that has telegrams delivered to it. So they are the first people to know about each new development. Darwin sends them copies of all his new papers. Professor Henslow at Cambridge, who they had studied with, sends his papers to the museum as well. So they're collecting information about what's going on right across Britain and the world as far as science is developing. And they're taking all those ideas and saying, right, how are we going to contribute to this? But also, how are we going to share it with the people in Shrewsbury so that they learn and develop? And that was another side to the museum, was about sharing this stuff more widely. And you get other people like William Penny Brooks down in Much Wenlock, who we all know as the Olympian character.
Well, we all know as the Olympian character, yes.
Yes. Yeah. So he founds this Olympian society that creates the first kind of modern Olympic Games in Much Wenlock. But he also creates a reading room and museum, and he goes out and he's collecting herbarium specimens. He's a doctor, so he's learnt about plants as part of his training to be a doctor. And he encourages the local people to collect plants and bring them to the museum, collect fossils and bring them in. And then they display them in a way that teaches people about the world around them and shares that knowledge.
Darwin, of course, was the son of a scientist. Mm-hmm. So science was very much in his family, wasn't it? So his father, remind me his name.
Robert Darwin.
Robert, that's it, Robert Darwin. So he was a member of the Lunar Society.
Yes. So his father had been a great thinker, and in fact his grandfather Erasmus Darwin. These were all men who were very caught up in the development of scientific thinking. They were all doctors, so they had a background in science. And in fact, Robert Darwin, as a local doctor, was buying chemicals and drugs from local chemist shop in the town, as well as chemicals for his son to use for his experiments. And in fact, through that connection, I'm sure Darwin would have met the son of the local chemist, Henry Blunt, who went on to become a scientist himself.
All right. Okay. So you've mentioned Blunt before. Just remind me. So who is Henry Blunt?
Henry Blunt takes on his father's chemist's shop, but he has interests well beyond that. He's a very accomplished artist and he loves watercolour painting, but he also is fascinated by astronomy. And he sets up a telescope in Shrewsbury and starts to investigate the moon. And I can show you the results of some of his studies.
Go on. Yes.
So here we've got this amazing model that was made by Henry Blunt. So Henry was 3 years older than Darwin, and I like to imagine that he met Darwin in his father's chemist shop and they probably ran around talking about experiments and making things blow up together. And Henry went on to take on the chemist shop, but his love was actually astronomy. And he set up this Newtonian telescope at his house and started undertaking observations of the moon. And these developed into attempts to produce models of the surface of the moon in 3 dimensions. And this is one very rare example of a surviving lunar model that he made. The other one's in the Science Museum. And they were beautifully mounted like this to be displayed at the Great Exhibition in 1851.
So eratosthenes, that's a word I've not heard before. Is that a word that describes this kind of lunar model?
I think if I remember correctly, that is the name of this particular feature on the moon's surface.
So, okay. So how do we know that this fella didn't just stick his thumb in some plaster? How did he do it?
Well, apparently how he did it was looking at the shadows on the surface of the moon and then doing some incredibly complicated mathematics about the position of the moon to the sun, the length of those shadows, and then working out how tall the features that created them must have been.
That's astonishing. I mean, I was just trying to think, if I wanted to make something like that now, so I've got a telescope and I'm looking at the moon. So the first problem you've got is the moon doesn't stand still. It moves. It moves really quite quickly through a telescope. So I'm thinking maybe is some sort of projection onto a wall that he's observing and measuring?
He must have done something to be able to have enough time to take the measurements. And it's a very complicated bit of science that he's doing in his back garden in Shrewsbury.
In the 1830s, possibly just after the dawn of photography anyway. So we don't think he's probably using photography, but it's just incredible. And has anybody actually ever held that up to the actual crater and compared it?
I don't know. I don't know if the Science Museum have done any research into that.
That'd be fascinating, wouldn't it?
They have a model the same as this in their collection. This one came to us after just a conversation that happened to move in the right direction with a descendant of Blunt who had a family member who still had one of his models. And it was just a fantastic, fortuitous moment that allowed us to display this at the museum in Shrewsbury.
Because they are really that rare, aren't they?
This is one of only 2 that is known to be in existence still.
It's amazing. Amazing. So Emma Kate, I'm in a corridor of mostly stuffed birds. We've got a heron, an albatross. I mean, so what's the connection?
A lot of these cases were prepared by Henry Shaw, who again was another Shrewsbury shopkeeper. Like Henry Blunt, he had inherited his shop from his father and ran a taxidermy business in Shrewsbury. He was a very keen sportsman and huntsman, and that allowed him to make connections with the local gentry. But he also had a scientific interest in the birds that he was preparing. And a lot of his are seen as being very good quality displays of birds of the period. So people like Eighton, who was researching the birds of Shropshire, was getting his specimens prepared by Shaw. And Shaw was telling him about the sort of things that were being shot locally and brought into his shop to be stuffed.
Wow. So I've never seen an albatross up close, and I certainly wouldn't want it hung around my neck, but surely that wasn't shot in Shropshire. This has been sent to him.
No, he was getting stuff sent to him from all over the place, and he donated both local and foreign birds to the museum.
So these are fascinating, and you get to see them in the museum as well. And there's an awful lot of them. I mean, do they have another use, another purpose in a modern context, maybe?
Yes, I mean, although we think of these as kind of static collections that reflect science in the Victorian period, they still have a relevance for science today. So this is one of our 6 sawfish snouts. These were collected in the Victorian period and the early 20th century. And although they were collected mainly as kind of curiosities, they do have relevance to science today. In 2018, researchers from the University of Southern Mississippi came to visit us, and they took samples from the ends of each of them to do a DNA profile of them. What they're looking at is the fact that sawfish are the most endangered species of ray and are at risk of becoming extinct. One of the main problems is that they have a very low diversity within their genetic population, which means that they can't adapt to changing environments. What they're looking at is trying to ascertain whether they've always had a low diversity or whether overhunting and fishing over hundreds of years has actually reduced that diversity down and reduced the population. So they're still adding to our understanding of nature today.
Wow. Okay, so I have to pick it up. So what we're saying essentially is that sawfish aren't particularly good at making little sawfish.
I think their problem is because they're genetically very similar to one another. If their environment changes, there isn't the diversity for some of them to do well. So as their environment changes quite rapidly due to human interference, is that they all suffer rather than a few actually saying, oh, these new conditions actually quite suit us, and then the population grows from that group. What's happening is that they're all being hit and they're all reducing in numbers, which is what's really worrying scientists, is there may not be a niche for swordfish in the future.
So their inability to evolve, and we're back to Darwin, aren't we?
Yes.
We're back to that ability to evolve and adapt rather than survival of the fittest. It's survival of the species most able to adapt.
Yes, and I'm sure Darwin would quite like to think that some of the collections he was involved in during his lifetime are still adding to science today and driving our knowledge forwards.
It's a fascinating, fantastic piece. Really lovely. I'd like to have a go at a loaf of bread with it. So, how far I get. There's a wealth of knowledge stored in these objects. It just shows how important they are.
Yes, I think what's really exciting as a museum curator is you're taking on responsibility of these objects from people who were in this business 170 years ago, and you feel you've got to do right by them as well as the next lot of curators that will be here in 170 years' time, hopefully.